Yes, the 16 members of the SST did go to Benghazi on 2 separate occasions to support movement of the principal officer in that location to bolster the security that was there. She made trips to Tobruk and Derna, and they were needed there for the extra movement that she had, and to remain to guard the compound and provide a quick reaction force if necessary. We did that on, like I said, 2 separate occasions to provide that extra support. The SST loan to the security force, what goes above and beyond normal, I guess, law enforcement-oriented security. These individuals were familiar and carried larger caliber, better weapons, and the tactics they would employ would be to counter a military-style attack.
Thank you. Ms. Norton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Kennedy, I want to make sure I clarify one of the most controversial parts of this matter, and that is how the public first learned of the first reason given for the disturbances in Benghazi. Now, I understand that the State Department did not take any position, including the position taken by Ambassador Rice. So I think it's important to trace how the ambassador came to the conclusions that she reported on television. She said that her information was that the Benghazi matters were similar to the protests that had arisen in Cairo, and she referred to extremist elements, opportunistic elements, taking advantage, essentially, of that protest. Now, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued a statement that indicated that it had been the source of the ambassador's statement, and I'd like to read what the National Intelligence Director said. In the immediate aftermath, there was information that led us to assess that the attack began spontaneously following protests earlier that day at our embassy in Cairo. We provided that initial assessment to executive branch officials and members of Congress who used that information to discuss the attack publicly and to provide updates as they became available. Throughout our investigation, we continued to emphasize that information gathered was preliminary and evolving. I know, by the way, that Mr. Nostrom, you say in your testimony, I'm looking at page 2, that the ferocity and intensity of the attack was nothing that we had seen in Libya or that I had seen in my entire time in diplomatic service, indicating that this was something of a surprise attack, and I might say, suggesting that perhaps we should be about rethinking how to protect our outposts, since it's clear we're not going to do it with lots of funds. But what I read as the statement, Ambassador Kennedy, could I ask you, from the National Intelligence Director, could I ask you if you have any reason to doubt that Ambassador Rice relied on that information from the National Intelligence Director?
No, Mrs. Norton. When I came up to give a briefing earlier that week, followed by, I think, a day or two later by Ambassador Rice, both of us were relying on the same information. And as I said in my oral statement, that if I or any other senior administration official, career or non-career, would have been on that television show other than Susan Rice, we would have said the same thing, because we were drawing on the intelligence information that was then available to us. This has been, as you all know, a very much an evolving situation. What we knew that first week and that first weekend has evolved over time, so we know much more now than we knew then.
Indeed, the national director issued a statement on the 28th, and he said, as we learned more about the attack, we revised our initial assessment to reflect new information indicating that it was a deliberate and organized terrorist attack carried out by extremists. So we see the evolving nature of it. Look, I have to ask you about the diplomats who were stationed in Cairo, who were accused of by Governor Mitt Romney of sympathizing with the attackers. I'd like to know how these diplomats, these personnel in Cairo reacted to that criticism.
I'm afraid, Ms. Norton, I don't know. I have not had any conversations with the public affairs section and the embassy in Cairo, but I can assure you from just my general knowledge of for 39 years in the Foreign Service that there is not a Foreign Service officer or Foreign Service professional in our service who at all sympathizes or agree with terrorists.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan. Could you yield me 10 seconds for a quick question? Let's understand, what you're saying here today is that one piece of intel got you to guys, yourself and Secretary Rice or Ambassador Rice, to make a wrong statement 5 or 6 days later and still be making it. Because Sunday is a long time after Tuesday. So you're saying that you got it wrong and it stayed wrong, you didn't know any better between the 11th and the 16th. Is that right?
The information that was available,
the
information that was available from the intelligence community to both myself when
Ambassador, you're a great witness historically. I asked you, did you have any contrary knowledge over those 5 days? That's all I want.
No, sir.
Okay, you didn't know any better for the next 5 days is your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask unanimous consent that we give equal time to Mr. Cummings to respond and then give Mr. Jordan his full 5 minutes?
Mr. Chairman, on that request,
be honest, Mr. Cummings,
on a point of order,
requesting time.
On a point of order,
I'd ask unanimous consent that the ranking member have 15 seconds without objection.
On a point of order, objection, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, you just went over.
You don't have to apologize to me.
With all due respect, you just allowed Mr. Burton to go over by 2 minutes, and you're giving Mr. Cummings 15 seconds. You know what I mean? There's a little bit.
Mr. Chairman,
I'm sure you're going to balance out the time.
No, I understand, and we have gone over both on witnesses and that, and I'm going to pull it back into 5 minutes very solidly.
Okay, but just be fair to the
before we get down to your part of the dais, I will get there. I promise.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman,
thank you. Without objection, the ranking member is given equal time to ask a question.
Yeah, I just want to go back to you, Ambassador. I think Ms. Norton and the Chairman asked a very critical question. The Chairman talked about the 5 days. Can you try to explain that to us? That, during that period of 5 days or whatever it was, not having the information contrary to what Ms. Rice may have said. I understand it was based on intelligence, but can you explain how that could happen to the public? In other words, were you all still gathering information? Was the State Department in the process of trying to get it right? I mean, what was going on there? Do you know?
Mr. Cummings, we were gathering information. We were closely coordinating with our colleagues in the intelligence community. We wanted to know what was happening more than anyone else because we also had dozens of other embassies that we were concerned about, including attacks on 3 or 4 other embassies. So we were looking for every piece of information that we could get from no matter what rational and reasonable source to feed into our consideration of what steps we should take to protect U.S. diplomatic facilities.
Just last question, Mr. Chairman. Is it unusual for you all to rely on the intelligence community for that kind of information?
We have a great partnership, Mr. Cummings, with the intelligence community, and we heavily depend upon the information they provide us, just as they heavily depend upon the information we provide them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you. And now the gentleman from Ohio has exactly 5 minutes.
Thank you. I thank the Chairman. Lieutenant Colonel Wood, how many months were you in Libya?
I was in Libya approximately 6 months.
Mr. Nordstrom, how many months were you in Libya?
Approximately 10.
Ms. Lamb, how many times have you visited Libya? How many times have you visited Libya, period?
I have not.
None over the last 14, 15 months?
No.
None since the 200-plus security incidents in Libya you visited?
No, sir.
Mr. Kennedy, how many times have you been to Libya?
None.
Okay. Let me go to this process. We had numbers earlier from Mr. Nordstrom. You talked about 3/5 in Libya. Then we talked about you wanted 12 plus a backup of 6. So I want to know about this process. And actually, I'll go to Mr. Kennedy first. In your testimony, Mr. Kennedy, you'd say the Department of State regularly assesses risk and allocation of resources for security, a process which involves considered judgments of experienced professionals on the ground and in Washington using the best information available. So that process, I want to know how the decision was made. Are you involved in that process, Ambassador Kennedy?
At most normal occasions, I am not involved. There's an ongoing dialogue.
Where does that process go to? Are people in the White House directly involved in that process? Is Secretary Clinton directly involved in that process?
The process, if there are disagreements between the post in the field and the diplomatic security...
Would you classify what took place here as a disagreement based on what Mr. Nordstrom and Mr. Wood have testified to, what Ms. Lamb has said?
No, sir.
This didn't reach the disagreement level?
I would describe it as a dialogue between the post and diplomatic security.
So this didn't reach a level where you needed to weigh in, or someone higher needed to weigh in?
No, sir, it did
Anyone
not.
at the National Security Council,
No,
anyone
sir.
weigh in there?
No, sir, it did not.
Okay, Mr. Nordstrom, let me turn to you then. I want to know, in the email that Congressman Chaffetz referenced earlier, the interview you had with Congressman Chaffetz and Chairman Issa back on October 1st, you stated this is not, quote, not an environment where posts should be directed to normalize operations and reduce security resources in accordance with artificial timelines. And yet today in your testimony, it was a little different tenor, as I think the ranking member brought out. And you mentioned at one point the answer should not be to operate from a bunker. So I want to ask you these questions. First of all, since that interview with Chairman Issa and Chairman Chaffetz, staff has indicated they've tried to contact you 6 different times via telephone. You've not responded. Is there a reason you did not respond to those telephone calls?
That's correct.
No, it's correct you didn't respond. Is there a reason?
I had been advised by the Department of State that all
And who specifically advised you to do that?
Our Legislative Affairs Office.
And did they tell you where that came from? Did Ms. Lamb specifically advise you not to talk to
No,
him?
she did not.
Did Ambassador Kennedy tell you to do that?
No, he did not.
Did Secretary of State Clinton tell you to do that?
No, she did not.
So who was the person who told you not to talk with our staff after you gave this interview where you gave us this information?
I was advised by the Assistant Secretary Boswell, his office, his staff, that all requests for information and documents would need to be vetted or routed through that office.
Did those same individuals help you prepare today's testimony?
In the sense of providing general guidelines on how.
Did they tell you they wanted to look it over before you came in front of this committee and gave it today?
Of course.
And did they write it for you?
No, they did not.
Okay. Ms. Lamb, I want to go back to this this decision-making process. So is it customary to not listen as well, I would characterize it, listen as intently as I think you should have to the guys in the field and what they wanted to have happen when they requested the 12 plus the 6 backup?
Yes, sir. I listen intently to those conversations.
Okay, Mr. Wood, let me bring you into the conversation here. I want your comments on that specifically, the number you wanted in Libya plus the additional 6.
We agreed to the numbers between Eric and I and put forth those numbers. We felt great frustration, the fact that those demands were ignored or in some cases just never met.
So the process I was earlier referencing when asking Mr. Ambassador Kennedy, tell me who you felt was involved in that process. Who were the individuals in Washington? You were the folks on the ground at posts. Who were the folks in Washington in that process?
I heard Eric Nordstrom refer to Ms. Lamb as far as the deciding authority on providing those additional resources.
Experienced professionals on the ground in Washington. Who are the other experienced professionals in Washington help make that decision?
I wouldn't know the answer to that.
Mr. Nordstrom, who else? Because all we got right now, we know the Secretary of State wasn't, we know the White House wasn't, we know the National Security, we know Ambassador Kennedy wasn't. Somebody had to decide. Someone in Washington was telling you guys you couldn't get what you wanted. So was it just Ms. Lamb, or were there other people involved in this process, Mr. Nordstrom?
Again, I can't speculate in terms of who was. The person I dealt with was our regional director, Jim Bacigalupo, and then Ms. Lamb. The ambassador and the DCM, if I could just add,
you can
raised
finish.
the same concerns The DCM met with Das Lam also in February, raised the same concerns in person, and it's my understanding that Ambassador Kretz made additional phone calls. All of us at Post were in sync that we wanted these resources.
Okay. Anyone that needs to answer that question, but the gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Lam?
I'll take it. Go ahead.
On behalf of Ms. Lam, Ambassador Kennedy.
Now, because I want to make...
Briefly, please.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I was asked, on a different question, I was asked whether I was going to request a third extension of the SST. I consulted with my colleagues, and because our colleagues had put together...
Wait, but that's not what you said earlier. You said you weren't involved, and now you're telling me you are. Which one is it?
This is you asked a specific
question.
Okay,
this question, I'm afraid, will be for the next round for both of you. With that, we recognize the gentleman from Ohio also, Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kennedy has testified today that U.S. interests and values are at stake in Libya, and that the U.S. is better off because we went to Benghazi. Really? You think that after 10 years in Iraq and 11 years in Afghanistan, that our country, that the U.S. would have learned the consequences and the limits of interventionism? You would think that after trillions have been wasted on failed attempts at democracy building abroad while our infrastructure crumbles at home, Congress and the administration would re-examine priorities. Today we're engaging in a discussion about the security failures of Benghazi. There was a security failure. 4 Americans, including our ambassador, Ambassador Christopher Stevens, were killed. Their deaths are a national tragedy. My sympathy is with the families of those who were killed. There has to be accountability. I haven't heard that yet. We have an obligation to protect those who protect us. That's why this Congress needs to ask questions. The security situation did not happen overnight because of a decision made by someone at the State Department. We could talk about hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts for funding for embassy security over the last 2 years as a result of a blind pursuit of fiscal austerity. We could talk about whether it's prudent to rely so heavily on security contractors rather than our own military or State Department personnel. We could do a he said, she said about whether the State Department should have beefed up security at the embassy in Benghazi. But we owe it to the diplomatic corps, who serves our nation, to start at the beginning, and that's what I shall do. The security threats in Libya, including the unchecked extremist groups who are armed to the teeth, exist because our nation spurred on a civil war, destroying the security and stability of Libya. And, no one defends Gaddafi. Libya was not in a meltdown before the war. In 2003, Gaddafi reconciled with the community of nations by giving up his nation's pursuit of nuclear weapons. At the time, President Bush said, Gaddafi's actions made our country and our world safer. Now, during the Arab Spring, uprisings across the Middle East occurred, and Gaddafi made ludicrous threats against Benghazi. Based on those verbal threats, we intervened, absent constitutional authority, I might add. We bombed Libya. We destroyed their army. We obliterated their police stations. Lacking any civil authority, armed brigades control security. Al-Qaeda expanded its presence. Weapons are everywhere. Thousands of shoulder-to-air missiles are on the loose. Our military intervention led to greater instability in Libya. Many of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, made that argument to try to stop the war. It's not surprising, given the inflated threat and the grandiose expectations inherent in our nation building in Libya, that the State Department was not able to adequately protect our diplomats from this predictable threat. It's not surprising, and it's also not acceptable. It's easy to blame someone else, like a civil servant at the State Department. We all know the game. It's harder to acknowledge that decades of American foreign policy have directly contributed to regional instability and the rise of armed militias around the world. It's even harder to acknowledge Congress's role in the failure to stop the war in Libya, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Pakistan, the war in Yemen, the war in Somalia, and who knows where else. It's harder to recognize Congress's role in a failure to stop the drone attacks that are still killing innocent civilians and strengthening radical elements abroad. We want to stop the attacks on our embassies? Let's stop trying to overthrow governments. This should not be a partisan issue. Let's avoid the hype. Let's look at the real situation here. Interventions do not make us safer. They do not protect our nation. They are themselves a threat to America. Now, Mr. Kennedy, I would like to ask you, is al-Qaeda more or less established in Libya since our involvement?
Mr. Kucinich, I will have to take that question for the record. I am not an intelligence expert.
Oh, you don't have the intelligence, you're saying. Well, I'm going to go on to the next question. The next question. Are Americans safer, Mr. Kennedy? Excuse me.
I think the other two may have an opinion also, if you wanted to ask them.
Well, I wanted to ask Ambassador Kennedy. Next question, Ambassador Kennedy. How many shoulder-to-air missiles are capable of shooting down civilian passenger airlines are still missing in Libya? And this happened since our intervention. Can you answer that question?
No, sir. I'll be glad to provide it for the record.
You're saying that you don't know?
I do not know, sir. It's not within my normal purview of operations at the State Department.
Does anyone else here know how many shoulder-to-air missiles that can shoot down civilian airliners are still loose in Libya? Does anyone know?
The figures that we were provided were fluid, but the rough approximation was between 10 and 20,000.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired. Did you want them to answer anything about al-Qaeda growth?
If anyone there knows the answer.
If anyone has an answer on that one, they can answer, and then we'll move on.
Is al-Qaeda more or less established in Libya since our involvement?
Yes, sir. And their presence grows every day. They are certainly more established than we are.
Thank you. With that, we recognize the chairman of the subcommittee.